All right, I'm here with Mr. Ben Dixon. This is his first time. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Since this is your first time, just tell everybody who you are.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Ben Dixon. I'm the editor in chief of the Union of Orthodox Journalists of America. We are the one of the largest independent Orthodox news sites in the English speaking world. Coming up on our actual 1 year anniversary of launching, we're part of a larger global network of local websites covering the lives of each kind of individual church. I'm also the founder and director of operations for the Society of St. John of Shanghai in San Francisco, which is a national federation of Orthodox parish brotherhoods and sisterhoods that work together to further the missionary and philanthropic efforts of the church, and also do advocacy work up in DC for persecuted Orthodox communities overseas and also Orthodox moral issues at home. And so, most recently, we held a big day of action in December on Capitol Hill in support of Metropolitan Onufry and the faithful of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. We had close to 200 Orthodox laymen and clergy from every jurisdiction in America come from as far as Alaska. We even had somebody from the Church of Japan come and join us. So, very successful event. And we're hoping to continue that work and advocating for our brothers and sisters overseas who oftentimes are victims of bad U.S. foreign policy. So,
Yes. Yeah, I understand that completely. And you just reminded me, I saw an article in the Union of Orthodox Journalists, and I just pulled it up here so I could just double check. But you got Metropolitan Onufry celebrated the liturgy at the Saint Agap, how you pronounce that? Agapitus Church of the Kiev
yeah, okay. Yeah.
Lavra Sunday for Saint Gregory Palamas and addressed the flock. So this is actually somewhat uh, some good news coming out of the caves there. Tell us about that and how did that come about?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the battle for the Kiev Caves Lavra or the Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra has been ongoing for some time. The Kyiv-Pechersk Lavra is obviously the kind of home and the arc of Russian Orthodox monasticism, dating back to the 10th century. And so right now, the UOC, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church under Metropolitan Onufry, which is recognized as the canonical Church of Ukraine by 11 of the 14 universally recognized autocephalous churches in the world. They currently have possession of parts of the lower cave over the last several years, really since 2022. Different parts of the Caves Lavra have been seized by the government in cooperation with a schismatic group known as the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, set up in 2019 by Patriarch Bartholomew at the behest of Mike Pompeo and the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. So there was it got a lot of attention in 2023, especially when the faithful decided that, hey, we need to defend the Lavra. And so thousands and thousands of Ukrainians came to the Lavra and basically formed a human wall around it for several months, with police trying to slowly encroach and take kind of one building at a time. Um, since that time, government pressures continue to rise, and unfortunately, it's a time of war and destitution, and so people, have to be able to feed their families, and so they go home. But there is still a group of people who meet at the Lavra every day to continue to pray a Kathist and to ask for the protection of God and the saints of the Kiev Caves over what remains of the Lavra under the canonical church.
I was reading an article earlier. Let me see if I can find it. Um, Talking about how a lot of the caves are still closed. They did open up part of them, and was it the top section? I just saw it there.
The upper
Uh,
caves, yeah.
yeah, they were opening up the upper caves, but they were keeping the rest of them closed, and they had moved some families into the caves to take over the cells and had families residing in the cells. That seemed like to me that seems like a real slap in the face. Like when you come in what 2022, 2023, um the monks have been there worshiping and 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 holding down the monastery, taking care of the monastery and praying for the world, for all of us, and doing really a lot of the hard spiritual lifting that many of us can't do on a regular basis. And you come in and you kick them out of the holy sites, and then you move families into their cells. I didn't really understand what that was all about. Was this like a power play by the OCU, or what's going on there?
Yeah. So one thing you have to understand is that the OCU has no monks. Um, and so this goes back to kind of the mid 90s when the first schism occurred in Ukraine. And because all of the startseed, all of the elders of Ukraine said, no, the UOC is a canonical church. What Philaret is doing is uncanonical. None of the monastics joined the schismatics. And monasticism is the kind of thing that you have to have in order for it to grow. And so it's pretty much been devoid of monks. And so today, I think the OCU has a total of about 500 monks throughout all of Ukraine. Whereas the UOC, I believe, has something. I think it's in the orders of the over tens of thousands more is kind of the number. I don't have the exact figure. Um, and so when they took the Lavra, when they took the Upper Lavra, they didn't have enough monastics to fill it and to care for it. In fact, even if they brought all of their monastics from across Ukraine, they wouldn't have enough to fully man and care for the Lavra. Obviously, a big part of what monastics do is care for the monastery. That's part of their obediences. When the UOC took over the Kiev Lavra in 91, when the Soviet government fell and the Lavra was handed back over to the church on kind of a lease agreement, it was incomplete. It was ruins. It was nothing but piles of bricks. And the UOs, everything that you see in the Kiev Lavra today was rebuilt by the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And so now that it's in the hands of the OCU, essentially there are a handful of monks. I think it's something like 8 or 10, somewhere in that range, who are allowed to live there. But to live there, they have to be employees of the Ministry of Culture, because it's technically the Ministry of Culture who has retaken possession of the Lavra. And so these 8 or 10 monks are paid a salary by the state, and they live there to cover basic functions. But unfortunately, it's museum staff who take up much of the duties, right, of maintaining the monastery. And so what I suspect is that these families are probably the families of museum staff, right, who, it's kind of part of their pay agreement. Hey, you can live here in this space for the work that your family is doing. Um, Now, what we do know is that because of the lack of monks, key functions like the caring for the relics are done by these museum staff. What credentials they have, we don't know. Who they are, really, we don't know. And so we saw last year, for example, where the reliquaries of the monks, their caskets, were being brought out into the garden. And their vestments and such were being taken off and just hung over the fences, like they were just like they were sheets, like bed sheets, and not holy relics of the saints. The saints' bodies are placed on these trays, and they're kind of form shaped in the form of a human, that their body sits in. And that's because obviously, though these bodies are incorrupt, they do obviously dry out, right? And so little pieces can fall off. And so these trays are meant to catch those little bits of relics so they can be distributed to the faithful and not a single piece is lost. But these trays were seen stacked up against the side of the building. And in these caskets where you have relics, these museum workers were coming with spray bottles, no idea what's in them, ostensibly some type of cleaning agent that they're spraying in there and wiping down the inside of the caskets with the relics of the saints in them. And so it's a total blasphemy. And the thing is, even the Soviets did not do this. Even the Soviets, when they wanted to inspect the relics of the saints, they made the monks do it. They refused to touch them because, in spite of being atheists, that thought was always in the back of the mind. Well, what if this is all real? And what if I blaspheme God's holy ones, right? And he strikes me down. And there were stories of that happening. And so even the NKVD, right? Even they would make the monks handle the relics. But these museum workers under Zelensky have no issue defiling and blaspheming God's holy things. And I know as a journalist, I'm not supposed to use such strong language, but as an Orthodox Christian, I can't help but be outraged that this is happening. The saints of the Kiev caves were revered around the Orthodox world. This isn't even a Russian thing or a Ukrainian thing or even a Slav versus Greek thing. In Cyprus, the saints of the Kiev caves are revered universally. You'll see their icons and relics all over the island. And so the fact that Patriarch Bartholomew or Archbishop Gregorius of Cyprus or Archbishop Elpidophoros of the Greek Archdiocese is not crying out for justice is a great shame to our church, more broadly speaking. And so, in terms of these civilians who are allegedly living in the Lavra, I would suspect that these are museum staff and their families. And part of that, again, is that the government doesn't have much money; they're stealing far too much of it. But also, you need 24-hour monitoring of these facilities. That's just the nature of having any large building. I mean, I'm here in America, right? You could see in the Rust Belt, you would have a factory that was very well maintained. Everything was up to code. And within, 2-3 years of being abandoned, it's overgrown, the roof's caving in. People have to be able to look over things and make sure that things aren't breaking. And that is what I assume is going on in the Lavra now. What is not happening is the Lavra is not being used to pray for peace, to pray for an end to the suffering of the Ukrainian people, as it would be if the UOC were still allowed to inhabit its monastery. And so the Church of St. Agapetus and several other small shrines are still in the possession of the UOC, but even the abbot is not living on the property right now. They have made him move to a separate house off location where he is held on house arrest. And if he speaks about what is going on, he will be rearrested and forced to serve years in prison. So,
Is that Metropolitan Arsini?
no, so Metropolitan Arseni is the abbot of the Sviatogorsk Lavra, which is in the east of the country.
Okay.
And so you have three large lavras in Ukraine. You have Sviatogorsk in the east, Kyiv-Pechersk there in the center, and then Pochayev in the west. And what is his name? I'm trying to think of it now. Metropolitan Pavel.
Hmm.
Metropolitan Pavel is the abbot of the Kiev Caves, and in 2022 you probably saw quite a bit of him in the news because he was very outspoken at the time. They tortured the poor man, and essentially now he's on house arrest, and the SPU has told him, hey, if you say one word about what's going on, we're going to throw you back in prison. So,
Yeah, I was thinking it was Metropolitan Arsini because he was talking about the reason he had gotten arrested was because he was talking about the checkpoints at the entrance to the Lavra. So I thought maybe that's who it was. But I read one of y'all's articles again earlier today that he was now in the hospital, and so he missed his court date, his most recent court date, which was what was that today or yesterday?
um, well, Kiev time would basically be yesterday.
Okay.
So they're obviously 8 hours ahead, and so the news we post is a bit delayed. And I mean, in some sense, this is kind of their plan, right? To make things as difficult as possible for him to be free. Knowing that he has serious heart issues. He's been battling with stomach cancer for several years. Lost much of his stomach while in prison. And so all of this is unfortunately calculated, and is why we were pushing to have him extradited to the United States for medical care. But unfortunately, that was not able to be accomplished. So it's not totally off the table. So
Yeah, and it was the United States and probably a lot of y'all's efforts that got him put on house arrest and got out of holding cells, which sounds like a miserable. It really the way that it read, and I was reading about what the cells, the holding cells in Ukraine were like, and because of how poor the country is and how corrupt they are and how the money doesn't flow to the right places, it sounds like he was basically in solitary for like 2 years.
yeah, and so initially where he was in Slavyansk, and it was an old Soviet era prison, so not really meant for comfort.
Mm.
Um, but it wasn't even so much the prison cell that was the worst part; it was the transport to court dates, and so they would basically do like a week continuance at a time or a few days continuance at a time. And because of wartime conditions and other things, it was a 4, sometimes an 8 hour ride to court. And they would have him in what's called in English the glass box. And so you can actually look this up through Amnesty International. They consider it cruel and inhumane punishment. Essentially, what it is, it's a small metal compartment where you're essentially sitting in there like this. You can't move beyond this. There's no AC, there's no heat. And so in the summertime, even on, say, an 90-degree day, it gets to be upwards of 115, 120 degrees in those little boxes. And of course, there's no way to go to the restroom, there's no way to get water. And so he's stuck in there for 4 to 8 hours at a time, a man whose heart is hardly holding up even on a normal day. Um, and it was, essentially designed to torture him and to slowly kill him. And so they would do that kind of, day in and day out, week after week, month after month. And yet his spiritual strength is such that a lawyer visited him in jail and said, he came into the room and we sat down and I, thought that we were going to discuss his case, but he just wouldn't speak about the case. He just wanted to talk, about Christ, right? And just, how glorious Christ is and his saints and all these things. He said, and so, about an hour went by and the guards came in and he had a hearing. And so they're taking this hearing and they just left me in this hallway in this, Soviet dungeon, essentially. And he said, and I speak Russian. And so one of the other prisoners said, "Oh, you're here to see Vladika." And I said, "Yeah." And the prisoner says, "Well, you know what's happened here, right?" And he says, "No, I don't know what you mean." And he says, "This is no longer a prison; it's a monastery, and we're all his spiritual children." And this prisoner went on to tell him how since Metropolitan Arseny had come there, everybody in the prison had come to faith. That he had given them a prayer roll, that they were all going to confession. If they couldn't see him, they would pass their confessions to him and he would absolve them and give them a prayer roll. And that this had become the order of this jail that he was in. And so, I mean, he's a living saint. and a great man of God. And what they have done to him is, will make him, more assuredly a saint. Um, but they're going to be judged for what they've done to these people.
Yeah, and I mean, I read I read the prologue every day. I'm reading the lives of the great desert fathers. And you read it and you're reading something that happened like 1,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago. And you're like, that's unbelievable. Like, how could they treat people like that? And then you turn around and you look just across the world today, these things are still happening.
Yeah,
And it's just so wild to see.
yeah,
And
yeah. We're
you,
seeing the new Kyiv-Pechersk written in our own days.
yeah, you had mentioned earlier, and I wanted to touch on this because I remember reading about this probably right around the time that I interviewed Father John Whiteford about this the first time. So it must have been in 2022. It that Patriarch Bartholomew has has ties to the CIA, and some of the actions he's taking really appear to be in collusion with the intelligence community in acting against the Russian government. Can you expand a little bit on that relationship, how that relationship between Patriarch Bartholomew and the CIA got started?
Yeah. So Bartholomew essentially has a man in America, right? And that is Father Alex Carlutzos. And so Father Alex Carlutzos uh, is the spiritual advisor to the archons of the ecumenical patriarchate. He has been friends with every president since Jimmy Carter, Trump, not so much, but Biden, very close. In fact, Biden awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And so Carlutzos have been put in charge of something called Leadership 100, which is supposed to be a fundraising network for the Greek Archdiocese. And at the time, it was a failed organization. He took over, made it, something to be a part of, and became essentially the cash box of the Greek Archdiocese, and was the right hand man of uh, of the Archbishop of America at the time. Well, then the Patriarch of Constantinople passed away, and there was going to be an election. And Carlusos was basically able to convince the Bush White House that it would benefit America for Bartholomew to become patriarch. And essentially, the situation was that if the Turks weighed in, then the Archbishop of America would become the next patriarch of Constantinople. If the Turks stayed out of it, Bartholomew would become patriarch, and so um, that is what Carlutzos asked the White House to do, and the White House did, and he's said all this in recording and in interviews. And so he then became kind of the go-to man, right, between Bartholomew and the U.S. government. Now that relationship wasn't really profitable for a long time. Obviously, there was a cordial relationship. They, might have meetings, pleasantries, but it wasn't until Trump won where things really started to move, and there was some actual cooperation. And it's kind of a long story, but a woman who was involved in the training of the incoming Greek ambassador essentially put the bug in his ear that, hey, it would really benefit the State Department and CIA's mission in Ukraine. This is around 2014. If if we could use the ecumenical patriarchate to create a more regime-friendly church, a more Western-friendly church in Ukraine. And they basically sold it to the CIA and State Department as, hey, if you could do this, it would pull Ukraine out of the Russian orbit for good. And so Mike Pompeo, who was then head of the CIA, approaches Father Alex Karlutzos and says, "Hey, we would like for you guys to get involved in Ukraine." And Karlutzos essentially says, "Oh, well, we can't do that. We probably technically could, but we would lose any, political protection that we have in Istanbul, and it would be really problematic. We would need, the full backing of the United States." And Pompeo essentially says, "You got it." And Karlutzos says, "No, I mean like including military support if we need it." And Pompeo said, "You got it." And so a deal was essentially struck between Patriarch Bartholomew, the CIA by way of Mike Pompeo, and the State Department by way of Sam Brownback. And all three of them, Alex Karlutzos, Mike Pompeo, and Sam Brownback, have all admitted this on recording. And so, we have those recordings. We've passed those to, the heads of various departments in the administration, because so Trump didn't know that any of this was going on. And some of the fallout that has happened between the EP and the Trump administration, like the meeting that they had when Bartholomew was here, was very icy, and it was very clear. And there were sources in the White House who said, "Hey, this meeting really didn't go well," and Vance in particular made very clear that he wasn't happy about what they had done in Ukraine. Um, a lot of that is because Trump feels like Pompeo, who he doesn't like, had essentially used his authority to persecute Christians in Ukraine. And Vance, who is a Catholic and has spoken out several times on what's going on in Ukraine in the religious sphere, was really able to kind of push Trump on this. And we know now that part of the peace negotiation from the American side is that, hey, the church issue needs to be resolved. And so while the archdiocese and the EP may like to put up publicly that, oh, everything's fine, things are great, we have a great relationship with the administration, clearly that's not the case, because getting rid of the OCU is essentially part of the U.S. agenda for peace in Ukraine. And if things were so great between the archdiocese and the administration, they certainly wouldn't have a reason to so vehemently attack UOJ and the Society of St. John. But since we are apparently enemy number one for them and all of their media network, clearly this is a threat, and clearly that influence, since they once had, has subsided greatly. So.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up, but before then, I was just going to point out they should have probably talked to the Kurds before they struck a deal with the CIA. But I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, you know, so
There's too many examples that we could go through where our
right,
government, yeah,
not real good at keeping their end of the deal for some reason.
yeah,
So
yeah, it's a shame.
Archbishop Elpidophorus,
Alpida Forest, yeah,
Elpidophorus. Okay, I'm terrible with foreign names. I wish everybody was just
yeah.
named Tom and John, and I'd be like, all right, cool.
Tom, Dick, and Harry.
Exactly. I'm like all these Chinese,
Yeah,
but like that Dave Chappelle skit.
yeah, yeah. I
Uh,
love Chappelle, so that was great.
oh, but so he has been. It looks like he's been on a tour here in the U.S. trying to undercut the UOC in the U.S. and he's written back to Patriarch Bartholomew on his attempts, but it doesn't seem to be going well for him. And he's also, as you just mentioned, has named Jaw as Russian propaganda at UOJ, which I thought was just hilarious. It only takes you a year to become Russian propaganda. I've been doing this since 2018 and I still can't get anybody to call me Russian propaganda. I've been trying though.
Well, if you talk to us enough, you'll get the label. So,
I don't
I
know.
mean, I wish, hey,
I'm at the
we'd be much
Libertarian
better funded
Institute.
if we were.
I'm at the Libertarian Institute with Scott Horton, who debated Bill Kristol and kicked his butt on stage. I still can't
Yeah.
get the label.
Yeah. Well, hey, if we're Russian propaganda, then I'm going to have to find a way to send Putin a different address because his checks
Right.
ain't coming. So,
I'm not getting
and
I'm
I
not
could
getting
use the
my
money.
checks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Elpifedorus, Archbishop Elpifedorus has been on kind of this tour to undercut not only the UOJ, but he's uh, been writing back and forth with Patriarch Bartholomew. It looks like he's not having much luck undercutting the UOC here in the United States, which I would say that's a positive. But then I saw an article come out today that in Komariv, UOC church peacefully, quote unquote, peacefully transferred to OCU in presence of special forces. So it looks like they're still commandeering churches under the banner of the OCU. And what struck me here, and one of the things, I'm just going to kind of go off just for a second before I let you respond to all this. What struck
Yeah.
me
Go
here
for it.
is so Father Michael, the priest at my church, I go to an Antiochian church. So I go to church with a lot of like cradle Orthodox from Lebanon, Syria, in that area. And I've talked to a
Great
lot of
people.
these, they're amazing people, just some of the most
Yeah.
joyful, wonderful people I've ever been around. And I've talked to a lot of them about the history of the church and what they know from stories handed down from their parents and their grandparents. And I know that Father Michael, who's from Chile, but he went to university in Lebanon to St. John's. Saint I think it's St. John of
Mm,
Damascus in Lebanon, and that's where he met his wife. And his wife is from Lebanon, and she was telling me that the big issue that they have is the Catholics came in at some period. I don't even remember what century she told me it was. She got real specific, but she was very perturbed by this. She was like, they came in and they just took over our churches and they split up families and they ruined the church in the Middle East, in Lebanon, in Syria. And I don't I don't know if Patriarch Bartholomew isn't aware or conscious of what's happening here, but this is what they're doing in Ukraine. This is what they're doing. I mean, they're essentially sending archbishops over to the US to say, hey, y'all need to stop supporting the UOC and support the OCU. I mean, you're trying to divide the church here in America, which already has its own, you know, troubles between, the Greek Orthodox Church and the OCA and the ROCOR. And there's already these little divisions and that are occurring, but they're trying to create a much larger schism, which is not something we need in today's day and age. Sorry, that my
Yeah.
soapbox is done. I'll get off of it.
So yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. In terms of America, I think for a long time the Greeks have been able to kind of throw their weight around because they have money. They've been able to kind of inflate their numbers to make people think that they're much bigger than they are. New data, more accurate data, has shown that that's not quite the case. Um, and especially since we started doing these days of action and really kind of organizing things, um, we have seen the other jurisdictions really come together. And so, one of the reasons why they're pushing back so hard right now is because if you go to the Antiochian Facebook, if you go to the Romanian or the Bulgarians Facebook, if you go to ROC or the OCA's Facebook, what do you see? You see them all together, celebrating for this, celebrating for that, giving each other these relics. Oh, here's a gift of this relic, right? They're all doing things together. You look on the Greek Archdiocese website, or you look at Orthodox Observer, the only people who Elpidophoros can get to celebrate with him are Catholics. And so they see that, oh, the other jurisdictions are doing these things against our interests. They're doing things together without the assembly of bishops. And that really threatens them. The Assembly of Bishops has really been Elpidophoros' way of kind of keeping a clamp down on all the other jurisdictions, because when they're there, he's the man, right? It's his thing. They call it the Assembly of Canonical Bishops, but really it's Elpidophoros' council. Um, they've been able to use it to kind of push back on certain things as a block. But 9 times out of 10, he gets what he wants. And that's why there's been so much talk the last, 4 months in particular about just leaving the Assembly of Bishops. And you even see in this letter that he sent to Bartholomew, he says, some extreme voices are calling for, an end to the Assembly of Bishops. Who are these? Who are these extreme voices? Metropolitan Sava of Antioch? He's an extremist now. Bishops of the OCA, they're extremists now. It's nonsense. And so on the American front, that's what you're seeing. They're pushing back because they see that the tide has really turned and that America has a pan-Orthodox future. Whereas pan-Orthodox for Elpidophoros and his little clique is everybody comes to our things and they do it in Greek. That's pan-Orthodox. No, in America, pan-Orthodox is going to be in English. Sorry. All the other churches agree. They say, yeah, if we're doing a pan-Orthodox thing, English is the uniting language. It's the language of the land. We should be doing it that way. To touch on the Lebanon thing, yeah, the Catholics came in, and what they offered was education. And what you have to understand about that period of time is that the Patriarch of Constantinople, because of the millet system, which was it was basically you were a citizen of your religious group within the empire. And so the Patriarch of Constantinople was an ethnarch. He was a viceroy, essentially, of the Sultan to rule over all Orthodox Christians. And so essentially in that schema, to be Greek and in the church was to be powerful. And so they abolished, all the churches in the Balkans and were forcing Greek customs on them, which is why you see a lot of more Hellenic customs, and even the Serbian church, where you see a lot of more Byzantine style chant, you see Greek style vestments, and in the Middle East, all the patriarchates were run by Greeks, and so the Brotherhood of the Holy Sepulchre was completely Greek, in spite of the fact that 95% of the faithful were Arab and spoke Arabic. And it was the same in Antioch. And so what ended up happening was that Russians would go on pilgrimage to the Holy Land and see, oh, like they have no schools and their kids are becoming Catholic as a result because that's the only place they can get an education. Well, they need schools. And so they go to the Patriarchate of Jerusalem and say, hey, we're happy to open schools and the Tsar will pay for it. And we'll teach them in Arabic. And they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, you can't teach them in Arabic. I'm like, well, why not? That's the language that they speak. And so Jerusalem really pushed back on it. Now, Antioch was much more open to it. And so the Russians started opening all of these schools. And what ended up happening was that the Arabs then took over the Patriarchate of Antioch. There was an election, there was an Arab candidate and a Greek candidate. And Constantinople supported the Greek candidate, but they didn't just support the Greek candidate. They tried to get the Sultan to throw out the Russians and to just say, we'll only accept a Greek. Fortunately, the Tsar was strong enough to say, no, there's going to be a free and fair election. And that's why the Patriarch of Antioch became the Arab Patriarchate and why it has survived to this day in spite of all the troubles that it's had. But it was out of those Russian schools also that Arab nationalism, came about. The whole Renaissance in Arabic literature and sciences, all this came out of those schools. And so it was a stopgap measure against the Latinizing of the region. And this was an ongoing problem because a lot of Christians, a lot of Orthodox Christians in the region wanted education, and the Greek Patriarchate of Constantinople would not allow it and was pressuring Jerusalem to not allow it. And so eventually, all those people went to the Jesuits and said, hey, will you allow us to educate our kids and maintain our rights if we'll submit to Rome? And they said, yeah. And that's how the Melkite schism was born. And so when you hear about Melkites, right, Eastern, Byzantine Catholics, that all comes out of Constantinople not wanting to educate Arabs. And so it's ironic when they talk about ethnophilatism, because ethnophilatism has been the official position of the Patriarchate of Constantinople for hundreds of years. And we see this now playing out in Ukraine, right, where they're driving a wedge and they're saying, "Oh, well, Ukraine should have its own church because it's independent." Well, it had its own church. You agreed that it was its own church, but now suddenly because it's convenient and you can, try to seize this massive part of the church for yourself, suddenly it's convenient. If you're ideologically consistent, there'd be no Greek archdiocese in America. Do Americans not deserve their own autocephalous church? So it's hypocrisy, and it's a divide and conquer mentality um, that Constantinople has. And so I always say it's not so much that Constantinople is neo-papist; it's that they are trying to bring back the millet system. They want to be the ethnarch of the Orthodox. They want to be over all the Orthodox and force the Orthodox to submit to them as it was under the Ottoman Empire.
Hmm. Well, and I mean that could be a lot of God's reasoning behind Constantinople now being Istanbul. And
Yeah, could be.
so I mean there's a lot there. Do you do you think that there will be like a an American Orthodox that comes out of all this, or do you think it's always going to be kind of this pan-Orthodox kind of uh outlay? Because I just the way I look at it nowadays is so many people in America travel so much, go to different states, and like I've gone to St. Jonah in spring for liturgy. I've been to I mean St. Joseph's started off as a missionary of our church. St. Joseph's in Houston started off as a missionary of our church, and then you know there's was it Holy Archangels monastery up there in the hill country. And I think that Holy Archangels is technically Greek, is considered Greek, but
Yeah.
everybody around here, it doesn't matter if it's Rokor or if it's Antiochian or what it is, they'll always tell you, yeah, take a pilgrimage to Holy Archangels, and visit the monastery. And it just seems like it's almost what got me thinking about this is Father Josiah Trenum was talking about it on an interview the other day that he would really like to see that come about, and he thinks that would really be good for the US. But I don't even know if it's even possible that the way that the dividing lines are drawn out, and having so many patriarchs, so many metropolitans from so many dioceses, it doesn't, I don't know if it's even possible.
Yeah. Well, to start, um, I think we should remember that the Russian church was under Constantinople for at least 400 years. Um, we had this idea that, well, okay, well, we have a church, we're ready to go. But that's not the case, right? Russia, the entire country, had been Orthodox for several hundred years before they became independent, and it was only
Mm.
really then because of the Council of Florence. Um, so I don't think there's any rush. At the same time, while on the historical topic of it, we had one church essentially, right? Like the Russians came through Alaska, and so they had jurisdiction over North America, and all the ethnic churches who came, they might still be a Greek parish, a Syrian parish, a Serbian parish, but they were under the umbrella of the Russian Metropolia of North America. And St. Tikhon's vision was that there would be, that there would be a bishop for each of these ethnic groups, right? But then they would all meet in a central synod to govern affairs more broadly in America with the under the presidency of the Synod, then the Synod in Moscow. And so the idea being that you would plant this church and allow it to grow, but it would always have that connection with the mother church until it was really ready to kind of spread its wings. Then the October Revolution happens, and the Russian church is in chaos. And St. Tigon basically says, hey, those of you who are outside of Russia, you need to govern yourselves until such a time as you can reestablish communication because things are just too bad here right now. And his idea was that the Church of America should go under Antioch. Unfortunately, what happened was that a lot of the ethnic jurisdictions, the Greeks first of all, decided, well, we'll just appeal to our synods at home and be an exarchate of these our churches back home. And this was complicated by the fact that the St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York City, that the living church, right, the heretical Soviet church, launched a lawsuit in New York for the St. Nicholas Cathedral against the Metropolia, and they won. And so that spread a lot of panic through the churches of America, who then quickly appealed to their home synods and patriarchates for protection. And that situation has continued on, and unfortunately, because the because the leadership of the OCA in the early days couldn't submit to the wider synod of the Russian Church abroad, it then found itself without much, maybe with continuity, but with no real legality. And so that kind of gave a lot of justification for these other churches to kind of move in. Because all those churches at the time recognized the Synod of the Russian Church abroad, which is kind of the benefit for the American bishops to, rejoin this Russian Synod. But, in God's providence, that didn't work out. And here we are. But I think, looking at the situation as it is, I think in some sense it was providential that we don't have a united hierarchy, because that might be a hierarchy that is, under the archdiocese, the Greek archdiocese, which would be very problematic, or combined with some of these other liberal elements that would just outweigh those who are really zealous for the true faith and don't want to see it molested and modernized. So in God's providence, all things works out. I think it'll be probably a couple hundred years, realistically, until we're ready for a real autocephalous American church. I think what the American church, so much as it exists, has to offer the Orthodox Church globally, because every national church has something to offer to the wider church. I think for the American church, what we have to offer is unity. If we can work out our issues here between the various churches where we all have to live together, then we can reconcile the differences between our mother churches back in the old country. And one thing which is encouraging with this is that even though there's technically a schism between the Russian church and the Greek church, it was because of a Russian bishop in America, Archbishop Peter of blessed memory, that the laity are not held to that. He essentially said to the Moscow Patriarchate that, hey, you can't do this to my people. Like, my people in America, they're all very integrated with all the different communities. So you would be splitting up our families if you say that Russian laymen and Greek laymen can't commune together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's encouraging, right? Because in spite of the fact this is a very serious issue, one worthy of breaking communion and taking a hard stand, in spite of that, it's not a full-blown schism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There was restraint because of the people, because of the laity. And so that gives me hope for the future, and that we can work these things out and come together as a church and have something meaningful to offer back to the global Orthodox community.
That's really interesting because I always wondered how this little Antiochian church in nowhere, Texas, like in the middle of the Gulf Coast, ended up being the second parish that Saint Raphael of Brooklyn set up, and yet it wasn't a Russian church. It ended up being an Antiochian church due to the Lebanese population down here. And I was reading a little bit about him the other day, and how he had just gone and found pockets of different Orthodox, no matter what, what their background was, whether they were Greek or Syrian or Lebanese or, Antiochian, whatever it was, that he was finding them and just setting up parishes for them and celebrating liturgy with them there early on. And he basically lived like a nomad, just traveling around conducting
Yeah.
liturgies. And I thought that was like a really cool story. But I always wondered how we went from being set up by the Russian church to becoming the Antiochian church. So that really explains a lot. And yeah, what you said there at the end makes a lot of sense because like I go to an Antiochian church here, but my dad and my mom, they go to a Greek church where they live because it's closer to them. They enjoy the people, and they were debating between going to St. Jonah and the current church they go to. I can't remember the name of it for the life of me. Um, and they chose this one just because it was 10 minutes closer to their house, and they were like, yeah, it's just an easier drive. I like the church, I like the people. Like, why not go there? And I was like, yeah, that makes sense to me. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that makes a lot of sense about the families being divided because I know that's a really big issue. People don't want to be divided. And if the church starts stepping in between families, there are going to be a lot of families that step away from the church because it's like why are
Yeah.
y'all why is the political system of the church trying to divide the family? Like that has nothing to do
Yeah.
with whether we're like faithful and worshiping and loving, Christ and doing what we're supposed to be doing. The whole politics, it drives me crazy. I don't even like to focus on it much because I'm like, I don't really understand what y'all are doing over there, man.
Yeah.
So I got one more story I wanted to kind of cover with you. And the last time I had Father John on talking about this, I think it was right after. Oh, it was terrible. The OCU had taken over a UOC church, and they had gone into the church, and they were they were just they weren't even conducting a liturgy. Like what they were doing wasn't worship. It was like it almost looked like they were trying to hold a rave or something, dancing with the candles and the icons, and it was weird. And I was just like, this is ridiculous. And this must have been, I want to say this was in 2023 or 2024 that this came out, was the last time I had somebody on to talk about this. And it was very disheartening. It was saddening to watch. And I saw this story on y'all's page. OCU priest allows parishioners to use priest cassock for sex games. And I was like, what? I read this. I was like, I have to read this entire story, trying to figure out what this priest is doing. So this OCU priest decided that since he's young and attractive and he's always getting flirted with by single women, that they should go out and find a man and marry him and buy him a cassock so they can live out their fantasies. And I was like,
Bizarre.
it's completely bizarre because one of the first things I was ever told coming into the church is like your imagination is not your friend. That is your enemy. That is the devil's playground. When you let
Hmm.
yourself like enter into fantasy world, that's where the demons like to play. And
Yep.
and he's encouraging it. And I just thought that was, he said it would strengthen relationships between couples.
Yeah. Also, there's a reason this is happening. So we've shoot, it was probably a few months ago now. But if you go on our YouTube, you'll see where we interviewed a former OCU priest named Father Yaroslav Yasenets. Um, and now Father Yaroslav has been a priest for 10 plus years. He was in the Kiev Patriarchate before the reunion and then was moved into the OCU because of the reunion. But he got so sick of things there that he left and went back to the Kiev Patriarchate, which is also a schismatic group, to be clear. Um, but he's very genuine in his faith. He actually studied at Hellenic College Holy Cross through a distance learning program because his fake bishop would not sign the travel documents that were required. But what he was saying is that there's no education in the OCU. Even, there was a video going around a while ago where a priest could not recite the creed. And that priest is the head professor at their theological academy. And so when that's the head of your educational system, you've got some real problems. He can't even recite the creed. So there's no education, there's no appreciation for education. And most of the people joining the OCU to be priests are not zealous Orthodox Christians. They're kind of everyday people who they don't want to get drafted, right? They don't want to go to war. They don't really have a job and they want a cushy job. And in Ukraine, where most of the population is Orthodox, if you get a good parish assignment, you'll live good. I mean, you'll have a nice car, you'll have a big house, your family will live comfortably, you'll be able to send your kids to college. And so a lot of these guys, they just say, oh, well, I'll become a priest if it means that I'm going to have a good life and not die at the front. And with that, they know that all they have to do is toe the party line, right? So if they say, yes, the UOC are a bunch of Russian agents, if they are, rah rah, Slava Ukraini, right, Zelensky's great, then they're going to get a good parish assignment. They're going to have a good salary. They're going to be set, right? Now, those who are nationalists, right, and who really want to make money, they'll get involved in the church seizures directly. The reason being that there are outside groups, largely, funded by the usual characters, Soros and the like, who pay these priests to engage in this type of activity. And so, like Father Roman Grishuk, who is a well-known church raider, he's led dozens and dozens of church raids. He's this big, jacked, young guy who LARPs as a priest. But everyone knows that he's being paid by foreign groups to do what he's doing. He drives a Mercedes, like a nice Mercedes. He's doing really well for himself, and he's doing well for himself because he's being paid to go and beat up old women and kids and to steal their churches, the churches that their grandparents and great grandparents built. So that's the reality in Ukraine. And so when you see these things, there's a movie or a cooking show in a church. The church is encouraging people to dress up in cassocks when they have sex. They can't make the sign of the cross. They're praying with Uniats and Lutherans and Jews. It's because they're not really Orthodox. They're just LARPing as priests because the OCU is nothing more than an extension of the SBU. And the SBU is nothing but a continuation of the KGB. And it's funny when people talk about the FSB in Russia, they'll call it the KGB. But the reality is that the SBU has far more institutional continuity with the KGB than the FSB does. In fact, when the Soviet Union fell and the SBU was formed, it maintained 98% of personnel from the Ukrainian KGB. And that continued, largely up through 2014. And, at that point, everyone who was low level was now the bosses. But when the war kicked off in 2022, the majority of department heads in the SBU were discovered to be double agents for Russia. And so, you know, that institutional continuity was and is still there. Um, so, I mean, that's what we see. So, for those who say, oh, the Russian church is just an extension of the FSB, maybe you should look at your favorite Ukrainian church, which is just an extension of Ukrainian intelligence and is widely known as such in the country, which is
Mhm.
why no one goes to those churches. Why do you want to go to a church that you know is a spy network? Nobody
Right,
does that.
right. Well, and one of the first things that kicks off in my head is these people are making a mockery of apostolic succession. It's just a complete mockery, not only of the church, but of the whole idea of apostolic succession, because I have a hard time believing that Patriarch Bartholomew would throw so much out the window that he wouldn't continue to go through the laying on that of hands and going through the ritualistic tradition of entering into the priesthood. So you're giving these people, you're granting these people a lineage to the apostles, to those that walked with Christ, and they have as much business doing it as I do.
Yeah. Well, part of the problem is that the OCU has never had legitimate apostolic succession. Um, and this was a big issue when the reunion council happened in the late 2010s, is that the none of the bishops, the so-called bishops of the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Kyiv-Patriarchate had ever had a canonical ordination. None of them. None of them even had hands laid on them by bishops who had apostolic succession but were in schism. Filaret in the Kiev Patriarchate was the only one who had at some point had canonical ordination, but he had already been defrocked by the Ukrainian church and then the Russian church on top of it. And Constantinople recognized that as lawful. And so they recognized that none of these people are actually bishop, none of these people are actually priests, and they still accepted them as those ranks. It's absurd. It's blasphemous. And it's a complete desecration of apostolic succession.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. Every time I talk about it, I get angry. That's why I don't talk about it much because but I
Yeah.
had a couple of listeners that wanted updates, and I was like, you know what? I haven't looked into it here recently, and I know Father John's busy with Lent, so let me see if I can get a hold of someone else. So I really appreciate you coming on, man. Will you plug anywhere people can find your work? You mentioned the YouTube page. I know you got the UOJ site where y'all publish news. So just plug anywhere where people can find your work and get in touch with you or any of that good jazz.
Yeah, so you can follow everything we're doing at uoj.news. We have pretty much every social media platform you can think of. So you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, X, YouTube. We do have a Patreon where we're trying to raise money, but also we're going around the world now filming documentaries and interviews. So we just did an interview with Archbishop John of Albania, and we're preparing a full length documentary on the resurrection of the Orthodox Church after the fall of communism. We're preparing for trips to Moldova, Romania, Serbia, Kosovo, Greece, Cyprus, and all of this is done off donations. So please, if you'll support us on Patreon, there's also a donation link on our website. To support the Society of St. John, where we do our, a lot of advocacy work. That's societyofstjohn.com. That's ST for Saint. Um, we're also accepting applications for membership. And so if your parish is not affiliated with the Society of St. John and you have a parish brotherhood, you can apply for membership there. If your parish does not have a brotherhood and you would like to start one under the Society of St. John, send us a message to the website and we'll give you resources and direction on how to do that. And there's also a donate link on the website. So if you can't do those things, but you want to help us to keep fighting the good fight and defending Orthodox Christians overseas, it's not cheap to, go up to Washington for, nearly a week out of every month, which my wife and I do to advocate for the church. So please do donate what you can to sustain these efforts. It's very important. We've been able to play a small part in the liberation of Metropolitan Arseni. We're working several asylum claims for churchmen and journalists who are being hunted by Ukrainian intelligence, literally hunted like dogs. Um, we're trying to get this anti-church law repealed. We can only do that with donations. So please, I hope you all will consider donating. And more than anything, we ask for your prayers. There are, unfortunately, the Ukrainians don't like us much either.
Right.
So we ask your prayers that God would protect us, but also to keep us humble and always doing all of this for nothing more than the glory of Christ and His church.
Well, I appreciate you. And I'm going to stop the recording now, man.